let me start by introducing today's presenter, which would be me, Richard Knudsen. I'm the Dynamic CRM Practice VP at Magenium Solutions, an IT consulting, a firm located in beautiful downtown Wheaton, Illinois. I'm also an MVP for Microsoft Dynamics CRM, and another interesting piece of news I have to report is that my book is finally out. Took a little bit longer to get it done than I thought it might, but I think it's worth the extra effort that it took. It's not the manga guide to Microsoft Dynamics CRM. That might be my next book, but this one is Building Business with CRM, and it's all about business processes. So workflow and dialogue processes, Dynamics CRM 2011. Details, and I certainly encourage you to purchase it at the website, crmbizbook.com, maintained by my publisher, the indefatigable Julie Yak. So check it out. And if you like today's session, you're going to love the book, because what we'll talk about today is a veritable potpourri of topics that I cover in a lot more detail in the book, that all meet, I think, several criteria, which are good for a session like this one. That is that they're interesting, useful, and for me at least, were non-obvious. So hopefully I can save you some time by going through these. So here's what we're going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to contrast things that you can do with workflow processes that also might be able to be done interactively through the user interface, and kind of give you some guidance on when it might be more effective to get something done with a workflow instead of doing it interactively. I'll talk a little bit about limitations, things you cannot do, business processes, hopefully save you some time looking for things that you won't find. Talk a little bit about working with closed records and read-only fields. That's a bit of a puzzler the first time you encounter it. There's a few related things there that I'm going to cover. I'll talk about what doesn't sound like a business process topic, but really is once you get into it, advanced find reporting and dashboards, and show you how you can use some techniques there in your sort of reporting, monitoring, and troubleshooting of workflow processes. This is kind of a special topic, working with hyperlinks and record URLs. There's lots of times, it turns out, when you'd want to include things like a link to a record in some content that's generated by something like a workflow process. And there's some relatively recent new functionality that's come out that a lot of people aren't familiar with, that I'm going to review that'll help you figure that one out. This is a big topic, security, who can run them, who can create them, and it's also probably one of the more confusing / advanced topics having to do with workflow. There are differences in the way automatic workflows work compared to on-demand workflows. Dialogues and workflow processes have some differences there, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Then we'll segue into dialogues, and in particular, I'm going to contrast when to use query, that is, query CRM data is the action in the dialogue process designer, as compared to a lookup, prompt and response type. They're related. They sound like they should say they do what they sound like they do. They let you work with data within the context of a dialogue process, but there are some sometimes subtle distinctions between the two of them, and I want to go through both of those. And I'll show you an example of it's a good way to contrast workflows and dialogues. I'm going to pick one simple little example, copying records, and contrast the dialogue approach versus the workflow approach there. You might find that useful. Okay, so first topic, what can we do with the UI versus workflows? That is, when we have a choice, when is it better to do something interactively as compared to doing it with a workflow process? Good example is bulk edits. Suppose you want to make bulk changes. You want to change a whole bunch of user records or a whole bunch of account records, things like that. There is a bulk edit functionality. These things can also be done with a workflow, so sometimes it's an easy choice. Not all record types support bulk edit. A lot do, but many don't. So in that case, you'd pretty much have to take the workflow approach. I'll show you an example of that. Workflows can also apply logic to updates. Can't do that with a bulk edit. And then there's a simple little thing that I think a lot of people might not be familiar with, which is that workflows can append and clear values, which is not something that you can do with a bulk edit. So I'm going to show you this next. Then there's another issue that's kind of related to something that can be done either interactively or with a workflow, and that's closing records. So workflows can change a record status. Think of a workflow closing an opportunity when certain conditions are met, or resolving a case, or qualifying a lead. Workflows can certainly do all those things, but be careful with records, in particular those three I just mentioned, that have closed dialogue. So when we qualify a lead, or resolve a case, or close an opportunity as one in the user interface, a dialogue pops up. Workflow can do that, but the dialogue never comes up. And I'll show you an example of both of these. First, I want to show you the bulk edit example. So let's switch to Dynamic CRM. So here we are in my Dynamic CRM Online. And what I want to do is show you an example of a place where you have a choice of doing something through the user interface, through the UI, interactively, or with a workflow. So I've got a slightly customized view of accounts here, and you can kind of tell from looking at this view that we've got territories. Look up now. Suppose we want to change this. Well, I could select multiple records, click Edit, there's your bulk edit. So what can I do with bulk edit? Well, I can select the territory, and I could assign a territory here, but that's not what I want to do. That's going to assign that territory value to every record. So we don't want to do that. You can't use bulk edit to apply any kind of logic, so the best I could do there, if I was going to say change my territory scheme or something like that, is to select the records in the right zip codes and then maybe assign territories that way. Now, the other thing that we can't do with bulk edit is we can't clear the values. What if we just want to start from scratch here? We're going to change our territory scheme, and I want to empty those out. Well, I can't clear in bulk edit. There's no way to do that, but I can run a workflow. I've got a workflow that's exposed for on-demand use. It's well named. It's called clear territory. And if I do that, we'll come back to that in a minute. While the workflows are running, let me show you a record type that simply doesn't support bulk edit. If I go to administration, select users, notice that bulk edit is disabled. There are some record types where bulk edit is disabled by default and can be turned on. I think users simply doesn't support bulk edit, but there's also lots of record types that simply don't support a bulk edit functionality. And so if I wanted to have a workflow here to update my users, to assign them, change some information on the user records, for example, if I had been using the Outlook client for my email and now I wanted to switch to the email router, I could make a bulk change of all my users in a deployment with a workflow to do that. So you have to use it in there. Notice now I navigate back to accounts, the workflow has run. So how could I use a workflow to assign the territory value based on something like zip code? Well, let's go take a look at a process that does that. So I'll go navigate to processes and select account. So let's take a look at the update territory workflow, and I'm going to take a quick look at this. I'll keep it activated for now. A couple of things about this. Notice that it will run automatically. This is an automatic workflow because it's got this start when trigger checked in here, the record is created trigger. It's going to run when a new account record is created. Scope of organization means it'll run for whoever in an organization creates that record. It's also available to run as an on-demand process. It's a pretty innocuous process, so it's not one of these processes that's going to do a lot of harm if I run it on demand. And you can kind of see what this does. It uses the zip postal code field and basically checks the value of it in this conditional block here, from starting with 0 up to 399999 is going to fall into this block, and it'll update. And you can probably guess that this is the East territory. So I've got another range of zip codes that's going to be used to assign territories counts to the Central territory, you see there, and similarly for my West territory. So it's a pretty simple workflow. Navigate back to accounts and run it. This time we'll run the update territory workflow. And if you vamp long enough after you run a workflow, I think it's something to talk about for 10 or 15 seconds before you start clicking the refresh key. You can usually get it to come out that the workflow's been applied to all those records. So you can see how that's a good way to make some changes. So it's effectively a utility workflow. It's like a data update, an intelligent data update in this case, because we're applying some logic to it, which is not something that you can do in the UI. So let's jump back to the slide deck. And we'll come back to the closing records bit. I've got a sales process workflow that closes an opportunity record if certain conditions are met, and I'm going to use that to illustrate the closing records point there. Let's talk about some limitations of processes now. So save yourself some time, and at least in the current version of Dynamic CRM, don't go hunting around for how to do these things, because you can't do these with workflows or dialogues. You can't delete records, can't run reports. It'd be nice if you could. You can't update more than 250 records at a time, which can be a bit of a bummer. You have 25,000 records that you need to make a bunch of bulk updates to. You can only do 250 at a time. That would be a candidate for what? Custom code, or maybe a scribe job could certainly do that. But at present anyway, you can't just select all records and apply a workflow to it. Although I suspect you could certainly do that with, there are system jobs. You can apply a duplicate detection job against all records that meet certain criteria. It's not obvious why you wouldn't ever be able to do that with a workflow. There's lots of record types that you cannot create, and I've got a chart on the next page that show those. So I'll show you that in a second. The next example I show you, I'm going to show you how some record types are partially exposed in the Process Designer. That is, you have different abilities. Some record types, your ability to do workflow things to it are more constrained than others. For example, you can create workflow processes for the user, team, business unit entities, but there are limits on how that can be triggered. You cannot trigger one of those workflows, for example, with a status change. So if a user is disabled, you cannot directly trigger an automatic workflow. But there's a trick, kind of a workaround that I'll show you that you could use to get around something like that. So those are some limitations. But here's a list of many of the most important record types that you cannot create with workflows. So workflows can't create lots of system records. Users, workflows, system jobs, reports, business units, security roles, teams. More on the business side, especially in the sales area, opportunity, quote, order, and invoice product type records. That is the line items on those sales transaction record types. You cannot create those. You can create an opportunity or a quote or an order and invoice, but you cannot create the line items that might go on one of those things. It would be nice if you could do that. On the service side, you can't create a knowledge base article with the workflow. You can create a marketing list, but you cannot add a member. That is, you cannot create a marketing list member with a workflow. You can't create goal metrics, and you can't create roll-up queries, a couple of things in the goals area where it would be nice if you could do that. Now, in the category of records that have some limitations on what you can do with them, I mentioned user, business unit, and team. So not all records are created equal as far as workflows are concerned. So in this example, a workflow for the user entity cannot be triggered by the record status changes. It also, you might notice, it can't be triggered by the record is assigned or the record is deleted trigger. Now don't get confused by that. I said workflows cannot delete records, and that's true in all cases, but in this case, the record is deleted. You see here, that's a trigger that you can use for an interactive deletion to trigger a workflow of a record, but notice it cannot be, in that case you cannot apply that to the user record type. So the user record type has some restrictions on it when it comes to workflow, but what if you wanted to know? What if you've got 500 or 1,000 users in your CRM deployment, and sales manager needs to be notified when the system administrator disables one of the users? That's a pretty reasonable request. Well, it turns out, this is a real workaround, even though that record status changes trigger does not work, what you can do is you can have a workflow that sits there and runs in a wait condition, and the condition that's going to be the wait is it's waiting for is that the user status is disabled. So this is effectively the same thing. It's done in a different way. And then you could do things like send an email notification to the system administrator or something like that. So let's go take a look at a workflow that does this. Let's flip over to CRM here. Let's go to users. So I've got 4 users here. And if I open up one of these user records, scroll down, click on workflows, you might be familiar with this. You can monitor workflow jobs that are running on a record by simply going to the form, clicking on workflows, and I can see that I've got this disabled user process that's already running for this, and it's got a status of waiting. I'll show you how this works in a minute, but let me apply it to this new record. If I open up this record here and I go to workflows, I can see that this one's already done. So let's suppose I'm starting from scratch here. I'll just delete that. Let's apply the disabled user process to this record right here. So I've got the user record selected. I've exposed this workflow. We'll take a look at it in a minute. It's exposed for on-demand use. I can run it. So I run the workflow, open up the record, and again, if I talk slow and take my time, I can get in here and have the thing that's already running. So this is the workflow that I just started. So what is this workflow doing? If I open up the workflow, I can do that from here. It's a simple workflow. It really just has one wait condition, and the wait is wait until user status equals disabled, and then it's going to create a task. So all this thing does. Now I'm going to run it. I'm going to trigger it, I should say. And how do I trigger it? I trigger it by disabling that user account. So as soon as I click disable here, the condition will be met. Puts Susie's record into a different view because she's now disabled. Run down and look at the workflow. We can see that it succeeded. So you can see that when that status changed, the condition was fulfilled, and then the task that was nested underneath there, create this task record, that was created. So let's go take a look at this workflow just a little bit more closely, and then you'll see what the task looks like. We'll sort on the entity. Here's my disabled user process. And let's deactivate this. Interesting, when I deactivate a workflow, it doesn't have any impact on any running jobs. So if I click on workflows here, monitoring from the actual workflow record, notice that I've still got this workflow, the disabled user process is still running, and it's in that waiting state on those 3 other active user records. But for this record, it's succeeded. But what does this workflow do? Runs automatically. Record is created here. You can see, sure enough, I can't select that record status changes trigger. But I can have it run when a record is created or on demand. And the first thing it does, it just goes into the wait state. So this is a good way of getting around that problem. Here's what the task looks like. Take appropriate action for disabled user. Following user count has been disabled. Then I use dynamic values to put the name of the user in there. Please take appropriate action, etc., etc. Then I put the record URL in there. Then I give it a due date. Who do I assign it to? I assign it to a team. Records such as tasks can be assigned to teams in Dynamic CRM 2011. And let's activate that workflow before I forget. Now let's go see where I put that task. What I actually did was I created a dashboard, and I called it Queue Items for the administration team. So what this does is it simply exposes a custom list on a dashboard for anything that, this is actually a list of queue items, anything that's in this administration team queue is going to show up in this dashboard because of the way I've got this view constructed. So this is a good way to get these things kind of got a nice front and center dashboard. Administrators, anybody that's on that administration team can be monitoring this and then take the appropriate action. So here's the task that was just created by the workflow. Here's the link. There's that record URL. That record URL, by the way, I'm going to talk about that in more detail on the hyperlinks and URL section. This was a new feature, I should say, in the November 2011 service update, this record URL. And here, the best I can do is tell the user to sort of, notice it's not a clickable link. I can select it, and I could, then if I want to, open up a new, if I go to a new tab, and paste it, and I could navigate to that user record. Sure enough, here's Susie Main's disabled user record, but it's not a very pretty, URL. Just putting that thing right in the task and telling somebody to copy and paste it might not be the best experience. So we can do a little bit better than that in some circumstances, and I'll show you a couple examples of that later. So anyway, that's that's an example of kind of a workaround. The point being that even though we can't trigger, in some cases, workflows automatically on a certain event, a lot of times there's another way to accomplish that. So that's the not all records created equal demo. Now let's take a look at how we work with closed records and read-only fields. Okay, a couple of things about this. These are related topics, and the way you handle these is pretty similarly. I'm just going to do one example just for time purposes. What can processes do with closed records? Well, for record types like accounts, contacts, opportunities, cases, processes can update them directly. So even though they're read-only in the user interface, a process doesn't care about that. So if you need to make changes to a closed opportunity or a closed case, workflows can do that. They cannot update closed activities, that is, appointments, tasks, phone calls. When those records are closed, even processes will generate an error if they try to update those. But the workaround there is the process can reopen those, then update them, and then reclose them. When might you want to do something like that? Here's a use case I had recently. A client synchronizes, their sales team synchronizes lots of appointments from Outlook to Dynamics CRM. And there are custom fields, appointment type and things like that they use in CRM, and they're required fields. They're important from a reporting standpoint. But those custom fields are not available in the Outlook appointment form. The Outlook appointment form is Outlook form. So when they synchronize those appointments from Outlook up to CRM, they can still save them and close the activity records without filling in the required fields, because those constraints are what? They're enforced at the form level in CRM, and the forms never get opened in CRM because they get synchronized from Outlook and close those from the activity ribbon. So in that case, we have a workflow that automates the process of reopening them, updating them, reopening them up temporarily, it is, updating them with the right activity types, things like that, and then reclosing them. That's an example of what you might do there. What about read-only fields? Well, you're going to see, I'll show you an example of this now. Processes have no problem updating read-only fields. So you have maybe read-only fields on the opportunity form. But if you've got a read-only field, even though the process itself, a running process, can update it, you can't get to it in the process designer. It's really a limitation of the process designer. And I want to show you that now, because this is definitely a tricky one the first time you see it. So let's go to my demo, and I'll open up opportunities this time. And we're going to look at a slightly customized opportunity form. And notice I've got a couple of fields that I might want to do something with in a workflow. Notice that this sales stage field is read-only, and the probability field can be updated. So this is read-write field. A lot of these fields are read-write, but a few of them are read-only. And what the workflow does in this case is it enforces basically applies a sales process to this. And the way it works is I create a new opportunity record, and I'll call this big Q4 project, and we'll give it user provided revenue 150,000. We'll say we get an estimated close date of, say, 9/1. I'm going to leave probability blank. We'll see what the read-only issue is in a minute. Now, if I save, the workflow runs automatically when a new record is created. We'll see this in a minute. And what this workflow does, kind of see what's going on now. Notice that probability got filled in at 35%. So what the workflow does, notice the gated sales process is waiting. we've got this in stages. So here's our workflow that's in stages. And the first thing that it does when we create a new record is we update the opportunity by setting some defaults for stage 1. And the defaults that we set are that the sales stage is set to stage 1 and probability is set, in this case, to 35%. Now what I want to do is suppose I want to change this so that that probability is set to, say, 25%. Let's go make a change to the workflow. So here's our gated sales process. Let's open it up and deactivate it so I can make changes to it. And I'll close the properties section here, give myself a little bit more room to work with. And let's go to stage 1 here. Look at the defaults for stage 1. The first thing I'm going to do is update the opportunity record. And notice in the workflow designer, the sales stage, it's read-only. That's because that field is read-only on the form. So if I want that field to be read-only on the form, but I want to make changes to it in the designer, I have to temporarily make it read-write on the form like I've done with probability so that I can actually make the changes here. So let's suppose I want to flip this back so that stage 1 opportunities automatically have a probability value of 25%. We sort of take that off the user's hands. They don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to change that back, save and close. Now let's activate it. And then I'll go back to the opportunity record type, the form, and we'll make sure that that probability field is set to read only also. So let's customize the form. Here's the sales stage field, and remember it's already read-only. Field is read-only. We saw that in the workflow designer. Let's do the same thing now to probability because I don't want users to make changes to that. I want the workflow to set those values automatically. Now that's done, I save those changes and I publish them. Oops. And as soon as I publish them, they're out there in the general population. Nobody can change probability anymore, but you'll see the workflow certainly can. So it's not a problem with the workflow, with a running workflow. It's the problem with the designer itself. So let's go to this Q1 order here, and let's push this along to stage 2. So here's our read-only sales stage and probability fields. Let's go to the sales process section. A side comment about a workflow like this. This is obviously just an example, but I like this approach. This can be a pretty nice approach for a staged process like this. What the wait condition is doing in this stage 1 is it's waiting for everything in this section to be complete. And the way this one works, I'm basically saying, okay, everything's done, and in real life you'd do what? You'd have a description maybe of the things that need to be done in stage 1, you know, identify power sponsor, perform, you know, opportunity, espionage, triage, qualifications, whatever you got to do to get, you know, past stage 1 here for your business processes, and then maybe you know, have a user sign off on this. Right? So I'm kind of saying, okay, everything's done for stage 1. As soon as I save this record, what happens is the workflow fires up. Let's go down and look at this workflow. Here's the gated sales process. So notice now we're out of stage 1. Now we've gone on to stage 2, and the reason that we're out of stage 1 is because this condition has been met now. Wait until those check for those 2 fields to be complete, then we just proceed. So now we're in stage 2, and we're sitting there waiting for the stage 2 to be complete. And you can tell if I refresh the record, even though it looks like it's still in stage 1, if I press F5 to refresh, you'll see this is now in stage 2, and notice that the probability is now set to 50%. So if I go to the sales process section again, let's say we completed this on May 31st, and it was Herb, the stage 2 guy, that completed that. I save it. Workflow fires up. Go to the gated sales process workflow. You'll see now it's through stage 2 on to stage 3, it's hit that wait, and now it's there. And it just sits and waits for that stage to be complete. And before I leave here, just to point out something else, don't have a slide for this, but this is a pretty good trick to know about. If you're in a running workflow, that is, you're monitoring a running workflow job, like I'm doing here, go to the File menu, choose Print Preview. This is a pretty good trick. This is actually a very good view of sort of for maybe a complex workflow with some logical conditions and some things like that. This is a good way to be able to visualize that process. Right? So sometimes you can't always take a screenshot because there's more, the workflow might be bigger than you can get on the screen. So this, you can go ahead and print it. So that's kind of a good trick. I like that view. One of the few places in CRM you get a nice kind of visualization of a workflow. Okay, so then that's an example of how the process designer deals with read-only fields, which is that it really doesn't. So if you want to make some changes, you have to temporarily make those fields read-write, then go into the process designer, make your changes, and then come out, and then you can get going again. Okay, let's go. We made changes to the logic of that workflow, didn't we? It was setting stage 1 probability values to 35%, and then we changed it to 25%. Might make you wonder, well, what about all those other workflows that we had running before? What happened to them? Well, the point here, this topic, is that if you make changes to long-running processes, that especially stage processes like that have weights in them, like the example that we just made, what we've done is we've effectively got two versions of the same process running. It doesn't impact any running processes. The processes that were already running when we made that change, they're still going to be running, and they're the old version of the process. How can you see that? Good way to see it. Yep. Good way to see it is to go to, let's go to one of these things that, probability of, say, 35% here. And let's go look at the workflow. So the workflow that's running on this record, the gated sales process, it's in wait state here. Open it up, and it's in stage 1. All right, it's waiting right here in stage 1. And if I click the View Properties, I can see what the workflow did. Notice the workflow assigned a probability value of 35% to the probability. Well, that's because when this workflow ran, that was what the workflow was supposed to do. But now I've just changed it, and I've got workflows like, for example, this one here, this project here. Notice that this probability is 25%. So when this one ran, if I look at workflows and monitor this waiting gated sales process workflow, when it went through stage 1 here, the workflow logic was to set the probability to 25%. So this is something that you got to watch. This is kind of surprising, because you might think, before you have some experience with this, that if you change the process, maybe it's going to apply it to all the running processes. Turns out it doesn't. So you have to be careful. If this is something that you make a significant change to some process logic, and then are assuming, say, from a reporting standpoint, that all of the records are going to have similar values, you got to be a little bit careful about that. So that is something that you got to watch for. Now, this workflow is written in a way that I could apply it to all these records on an on-demand basis. There's my gated sales process. If I wanted to, if I did want to get all these probability values in sync for the right stages, I could run this on an on-demand basis, but that's because I was careful to write it that way. So it doesn't always work. You want to be careful about applying a on-demand process to a bunch of records that are out there in your sales pipeline if you're not really sure what rerunning that same workflow is going to do. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. So that's sort of a design issue that you want to be aware of. It's especially important for those long-running processes.